Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction. I appreciate y'all having me back at UF. I really loved being a part of the TCD program when I was there, and it's a real pleasure to get to talk with y'all today and to see some familiar faces, familiar and friendly faces. So really nice. Thanks for having me. Of course, I have to start this talk out with a disclaimer that opinions and experiences expressed here are my own, don't represent the official or unofficial policy of any office or branch of the U.S. government or of the National Science Foundation. I'm here to talk about my experiences as a fellow, which do include, my work for the U.S. government. But of course, I'm not officially representing anyone at the U.S. government. So I'm just going to do a quick overview of the fellowship, and then I'll talk about my experiences during my first year at USAID, Agency for International Development, and then at the National Science Foundation during my second year. I'm still in the middle of that year, so that's a work in progress. I won't be able to talk in depth too much about some of the policies, especially, for example, agricultural policy in Africa, even though I did work in that office for a year. But I can talk about, what I did while I was there. And this will be a little bit of a what I did last summer kind of talk, but also I'm happy to answer questions as we go or at the end. All right, so let me see, figuring out how to work this process. Okay, so this is a picture of my cohort. This is actually our second year cohort. I didn't make the picture for the first year because I was sick. I'm way down there on the far left. And I just want to set some context here. I had no idea what I was getting into when I applied for this fellowship. I learned about it from a woman that I met at my first anthropology conference. She had been a fellow, sounded interesting to me, sounded like fun to live in Washington, D.C. So when I graduated, I applied for it. Just for context, my dissertation fieldwork experience have felt like a disaster. I struggled with health issues the entire time, and I felt like I barely got enough research done to write a dissertation and graduate. I defended my dissertation in March 2020, learned how to use Zoom so that I could defend my dissertation. In the middle of lockdowns, the tenure system collapsed. Everything kind of felt like a disaster in terms of my PhD and the whole process coming out of it. I did get a couple of good jobs afterwards. Teaching as an adjunct for a couple of semesters at a small Native American serving college in Southwest Colorado. Did some cultural resource management, and that stuff set me up really well for the work that I'm doing now. And they were good lines on my resume, but also just for the context, my dissertation largely focused on ritual ayahuasca use in South America. Like that's not your most mainstream topic, right, for working in the federal government. I wrote my policy paper as part of my application for this fellowship on repatriating public lands to Native American tribes to help them deal with climate change. Again, not really something that you think the federal government is going to be in favor of. And yet here I am down there on the end of the second row wearing my UF flip-flops, by the way. I got called out for that for a few times. So here I am. A quick overview of the fellowship. There's almost 300 fellows. We get placed in 3 different branches of government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, which is Congress, and then there's usually 1 judicial branch fellow. The majority of the fellows are in the executive branch and all the different agencies and departments, everything from well, actually not very many at the Department of Interior, but National Science Foundation has a ton, National Institutes of Health have a ton, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, State Department has a lot. If you go to work for the State Department, you get hired on directly. All of these positions do require a certain amount of security clearance, some higher, some lower. So that's something to be aware of. But you'll learn about agencies you didn't even know existed, like the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, and they ended up being really interesting. I interviewed for a job with them last year and didn't get it, but I was really happy with where I did get placed for this second year, which is at NSF, National Science Foundation. I wanted to go ahead and keep this slide. These are all, as you can see, AAAS slides, but I wanted to go ahead and keep this one just to show that you can make some good money as a fellow. The stipends are very generous. There's, full coverage, full health insurance coverage for yourself and your partner. There's a really generous professional development program. There's a great SDPF alumni network. Relocation assistance, which ends up not being as great as you think it'll be, considering how much it costs to move to Washington, D.C., but it is there. I think they give about $4,000 for the relocation. And then there's professional training and travel. depending on which office you go to, that can be greater or lesser, but I got $15,000 each year for training and travel. And that can be anything from career coaching, language lessons to, you know, traveling to a UN conference, or I'm going to go to several conferences for the National Science Foundation this year. I'd like to go to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues as well in New York, but we'll see if I can afford that. So it's a really generous fellowship, and it's really worth it, in my opinion. That's why I'm here. Let's see what else. Let's skip for that one. Next slide. Yeah, so again, this professional development process, there's a 2-week orientation that you get when you come in to work for the fellowship. That's really valuable, learning a lot of the history of the US government, the systems, how it all works, how to be successful as a fellow in this program. You learn a lot about professional development, how to work with other people, how to manage the systems and the networks of working in the federal government. There are these monthly workshops. AAAS hosts a lot of monthly workshops, events, that kind of thing. Again, very generous and pretty exciting and fun places to be. Training and travel funds. And then there's also affinity groups. The Fellows Network is very strong. That's one of the, maybe the biggest asset of the fellowship is the network of fellows, current fellows as well as alumni. There's tons of social groups. There's tons of interesting science and policy groups. I'm part of the Science and Technology Studies affinity group, who turns out are very interested in Indigenous knowledge, as is most of the rest of the federal government right now. And as Marianne has noted, a lot of the research landscape as well. And I want to put in 2 takeaways just up here at the beginning. My take on this fellowship is that it's really for scientists with social skills. People at the TCD program are really well placed, I think, for this fellowship, given our interdisciplinary work that we do, and also the professional training that we get at TCD. The facilitation, the conflict management, all that stuff is really central to the work that I do now. And I think really sets us up well to work in this kind of setting, you know, and it's a non-academic setting. It's very much about working with other people and knowing how to make that happen well. It's not always easy. So, you know, having those good skills is important. Communication, conflict management, all those things are really important. And then another quote that I'll offer you here is something that one of our alumni fellows said in a professional development session. He's working, I think, in the Science and Technology Policy, Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. I think is where he was. I can't remember, but he's very high placed. He's like worked his way up through the levels in government. And he noted that the federal government is staffed with former fellows, and they will take your call. It's a great way to, you know, it's just it's a professional development opportunity. And you have just a great network of people to reach out to learn from, to network with, that sort of thing. All that said, I want to address up front that not everybody's a fan of the US government, its actions, its policy positions, and I'm not here to be a cheerleader for those things because I'm not necessarily a fan of all of them myself. But my take on that is twofold. One is that I've tried my whole life to make a difference from the outside, and I didn't get very far. And I feel that there's a lot of work to be done on the inside from that perspective, right? We actually started a decolonization program at USAID. I've handed that off to a colleague of mine, another fellow, and she's taken it and run with it, which is great. And there's a lot of stuff like that going on. And that's the second point. There's a lot more work going on inside the walls of the federal government that I find myself in alignment with and that I'm excited to support. I never would have known about any of that if it hadn't been for this fellowship and this chance to work in these offices and in these programs. There's a lot of opportunity to do some good work here. I don't know if that's administration dependent. I think a lot of it is, but I don't think all of it is, because a lot of the people doing this work are career employees of the government, and they've been doing it for a while, you know, certainly before the most recent set of elections. When you talk with alumni of this program, they inevitably say that the fellowship is what gave them the foot in the door or the leg up that they needed to create their career. And that's whether it's a career as an independent consultant or as a high-level federal employee. The program isn't perfect, you know, there's definitely some critiques from the inside and from the outside, but they have a strong emphasis on diversity. And from what I've seen in my life, it's the closest thing I've found to a true merit-based advancement. And that's pretty exciting to see. Does anybody have any questions so far before I move on to the next portion of the, I mean, I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about the fellowship as we go.
So far.
So far, so good. Awesome. So the fellowship is for 1 year, renewable for 2 years. I'm in my second year now. My first year was at USAID, Agency for International Development, in the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security in the Policy Division. And I'm going to go ahead and leave those acronyms in here. For one, just as an indication of like, that's how the federal government works. It's all about learning your acronyms, which is, you know, being an anthropologist, it's pretty funny. It's an exercise in linguistics, learning acronyms. I got to be a part of the Indigenous Peoples Working Group and participate in that at the agency level. And then I also hosted one for my own bureau. I'll get into that. Ran a couple of newsletters out of my office, and then got involved in this guidance that the Biden administration released on Indigenous knowledge, and then subsequently was invited to serve as the executive secretary of that subcommittee. And I'll go into a fair bit of detail on all these things. This is just a quick overview slide. During our interview week, AAAS, this was when we first were, you know, interviewing to see if we got the fellowship and can find a placement. The fellowship people let us know that if we went to USAID for our fellowship, that it would be possibly a 1-year placement. AAAS and USAID have since terminated their relationship. So those of us who were placed at USAID for that first year have either gotten hired on as contractors, or if we wanted to stay in the fellowship, we had to go to another agency. So I did a bunch of interviews for the second year and ended up hiring on with the Office of Polar Programs in the Arctic Division at the National Science Foundation. Continued my work on the Indigenous Knowledge Subcommittee, went to Greenland Science Week, and we've got a lot of fun stuff coming up that I'll go into more detail on as well. So quick overview of what I did at USAID. You know, and with the Tropical Conservation Development Program, obviously, USAID is a big, you know, possibly a career goal for some people. I know I ran into a couple of former TCDers while I was there, Connie Campbell, who was kind of a hero of mine when I was at TCD, just doing amazing work. She and I got to work together, or at least attend some of the same meetings of the Indigenous Peoples Working Group while I was there. And I also crossed paths with Percy Peralta, who's another kind of fabulous graduate of the TCD program. He got hired on, I think, as a Foreign Service Officer, so he's going to be there full, you know, long-term as well. So it was really good to see some of the folks there doing really good work. I was placed in the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, which has now been restructured and renamed as Resilience, Environment, and Food Security. My functional title was a Policy, Analytics, and Engagement Learning and Communications Specialist. And that's a mouthful, and it was a real handful to get my, it was a lot to wrap my arms around as well. My background is not in global agricultural food policy, and that's pretty much what my office did. So it was a real steep learning curve, and I never quite got my hands around what they're doing or got a handle on what my team was doing. We had a small team in the policy office. It was about half a dozen people, wonderful people to work with. And I continue to learn more about what they were doing. Here's a lot of what I did while I was there. I ran a couple of newsletters. I have a background in journalism. And so that's how I got hired as this communications and learning specialist. Policy Matters newsletter kind of covered the work that our office did. These are internal newsletters, so I couldn't really actually share the content of the newsletter themselves. But, you know, with Policy Matters, I really redesigned it, set it up on the Gov Delivery, which is the authorized government platform for delivering newsletters. So it's a lot of software, learning platforms, that sort of thing. That's what I did at that job, learning how to use Google, the G Suite, all Google documents and stuff. This Policy Matters, that's a screenshot of a Google document that I used to deliver one of the newsletters. And then the second one, it just went out as an email, but that was a really exciting program to work on. The Comprehensive Action for Climate Change Initiative was formed in our office by a woman named Emma. And
Ja, in ieder geval heel veel plezier morgen. Yes, we're going. Now here. So we have.
Are we muting somebody?
Maybe, okay, it disappears. So sorry.
What was it?
Yeah. You can go ahead.
Okay. Great, thank you. One of the things I did while I was at this office was to start the newsletter for this Comprehensive Action on Climate Change initiative. Let me see, this woman, Emily Weeks, is kind of the powerhouse behind this program, and it's a global program to help developing countries meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement. So developing and rising to the level of change required by their NDCs and their NAPs under the Paris Agreement. So that was a really exciting thing to be a part of. I got to attend the global retreat of this group. These are all a bunch of African, real leaders in the space of African climate change and African agricultural policy and food security policy. Those were the partners for the office, the team that I work with there. And so they ended up being the people that we partnered with to do a lot of the analytics, the scholarship, the management of this program. And then we also had a couple of representatives from teams in Asia. Where's Suresh? Suresh Babu is in here somewhere. And then Latin America, we also have teams working in those areas as well, trying to expand this program into different countries in those regions. This was held at IFPRI, Institute for Food Policy Research, in downtown Washington, D.C. Got to be a part of that retreat. And again, I was taking verbatim notes the whole time and really without a background in food security policy and the stuff and the programs that they were talking about, even though I was taking verbatim notes, I still didn't really know what they were talking about most of the time. And I talked about that with my mentor. A lot of the fellowship, it'll place people, they expect you to use your techniques, your training, your expertise, and apply it to new situations. You don't necessarily get a placement in your area of expertise. Occasionally people do, but most of the time you're put into a new role where you're learning a new technical area, but applying your methodological training. And so that's a lot of what I did for this office. I still do think that it's pretty valuable to put people in these places who actually know what they're doing, which I did not. What I did know about, however, when I came on to work for this office, they found out that I had this background working with Indigenous peoples as an undergraduate, as an activist, as a freelance writer. I had written a lot about these issues. And then after my dissertation, after I got my PhD, I went to work at this Native American Serving College teaching Indigenous resource management and Indigenous global environmental movements, classes on that stuff. Then I went to work for a consultancy doing cultural resource management. So basically working with tribes, interviewing them about local land management and cultural resource issues, their preferences on that, and writing reports for the BLM and for a local conservation organization. We also did some tribal consultation with that company. And so with that background, when I came to USAID, they found out that I had a lot of experience working on Indigenous issues. They invited me to serve as the point of contact for Indigenous issues for my bureau. Again, that's the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, leaders in USAID's policy and programming on global agricultural food security, agricultural policy and food security policy, climate change, water, all these things. And they had asked me to take over as point of contact on Indigenous issues. Once I got into it, I realized how big that could potentially be, and it could potentially be really big. It took someone to take it and run with it, and I wasn't really able to because I didn't get hired to do that specifically. And so my office at some point asked me to back off that work a little bit because I was spending a little more time than they liked on that. But what it does mean, and potentially, this here on the left is a guidance document that was written before I got there, but out of our office on effective engagement with Indigenous peoples in ag and food security. And then here on the, go back, here on the right, is the USAID policy on promoting the rights of Indigenous peoples. And that's kind of the agency's foundational document on how we should and can be engaging with Indigenous peoples to promote their rights through our programming. So I worked with the agency-wide team on that policy and on the activities related to that policy. And then I worked with the Indigenous Peoples Working Group out of our bureau to try and promote some programming within our bureau along those lines as well. Where that ended up going ends up being really interesting. And that's pretty much where I'm going to take this next. So in late September, so granted, bear in mind fellowship begins on September 1st. You have 2 weeks of orientation, and then you start your placement in your office. By the end of September, I was already traveling, and I went to this UN, kind of a side UN organization, the Mountain Partnership, was having a meeting in Aspen. And I knew that Catherine Tucker had introduced me to a team that were going to be there. That's how I found out about it originally. So I set aside some money and I went out to Aspen to go to this meeting. Met up with Catherine Tucker, who is my dissertation advisor, unexpectedly, didn't know that she'd be there, and did a lot of great networking while I was there. The interesting thing is that while I was in the airport during a layover, I got an email that invited me to comment on a set of a draft document that was going to be guidance on the use of Indigenous knowledge in federal research, policy, and decision-making. This is a pretty big deal to me. Like, you know, this is a science policy fellowship, and I was being offered the chance to contribute to some real guidance on the use of Indigenous knowledge, even though it just came in the form of guidance. You know, there's different levels of policy that are issued, and this is kind of a low-level version of it, but it still was a federal government-wide document on Indigenous knowledge. So I went ahead and spent most of this weekend in Aspen trying to figure out what that meant, trying to go through the document and make some comments on it, and doing my best to restrict my comments to those to which I had a purview over, which was international work, although I had a lot more comments than that. But basically what I commented on was that, you know, with USAID, our researchers, our teams around the world are doing a lot of research on, you know, agricultural policy, and a lot of that looks at seeds and agrobiodiversity and stuff like that. But there's no protections. We haven't, as a federal government, as a US government, signed the Nagoya Protocol, which pertains to access and benefit sharing, the rights of Indigenous peoples to the intellectual property around those types of knowledge. We haven't signed that. So there's no protections for Indigenous peoples globally, given the work that we do as an agency and as a federal government. So that was my comment. Of course, I was overruled because the State Department says we haven't signed the Nagoya Protocol, so we can't say anything about it in the guidance. But what it led to was the opportunity to contribute some language to the document in terms of case studies from USAID and the work that we had done on Indigenous knowledge. So I networked with my colleagues at USAID, found some people who did know a little bit more about the programming that we'd done, because I was still a month in at this point, didn't know anything, and was able to write up some language that was inserted and released in November 2022 as part of federal policy on the use of Indigenous knowledge. And this is what that looks like. On the left here, we have the final memo that was released. Memo for heads of federal departments and agencies, guidance for federal departments and agencies on Indigenous knowledge, how to use it, how to properly engage with Indigenous peoples up front, build those relationships, and use the Indigenous knowledge. There's a lot of places where this can be done, and this guidance was mostly written from a domestic point of view, and it really doesn't serve international Indigenous communities well. And so that's something that I think we can improve on as we move this work forward. But this is what we have now. Subsequently, there was a subcommittee formed out of the National Science and Technology Council. The subcommittee formed on the use of Indigenous, subcommittee on Indigenous knowledge. We were formed to implement this guidance and to help foster the implementation of this guidance across the federal government. I got to go to a meeting of this subcommittee just because I happened to be in DC. We had an in-person meeting at the EEOB, the Eisenhower Executive Office building next door to the White House. And so this is a picture of that meeting from January 30th of last year. A very nice in-person meeting. You don't get a chance very often to go to the White House grounds. And so this was our meeting. I was just a member, you know, not even a full representative because I was a fellow. I came because I could show up. I wasn't representing USAID, even though I was coming as a fellow at USAID, but I'm not allowed to represent the agency. But they let me come and sit in, and it was nice, and it was fun to get. And just for context, this is the EEOB, and the picture was taken pretty much right down here. This is the White House in the foreground. So that was pretty exciting. Here's the inside of that room where we met. This is, it was really interesting. They had a photo display, a photo exhibition of Black Power, images from the Black Power movement, which I thought was personally really inspiring. Also nice to see here in the halls of power. You've got your portraits of Biden and Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris here on the side. Kent State University, an image from the walls in here of the room, a bust of Martin Luther King. So it was a really inspiring place to have a meeting. I'm sure that's why they picked that room. But also good to know that there's attention to this kind of stuff inside, basically inside the White House. This is in the White House grounds. It's not in the White House itself, but it is adjacent to it. So that was really interesting to see. Again, my summer at STPF in Washington, D.C. Here's my M&Ms with the presidential seal on them. And this is from the front steps of that building with the Washington Monument in the distance. So this is one of the really exciting things that I got to do and I'm still getting to do as part of my fellowship. I'm going to go back a little bit to show. Subsequently, after this meeting, I was invited to serve as the executive secretary. Let me show this woman here. This woman, Gretchen Goldman, right here in the front center, is the one who started the whole Indigenous knowledge guidance process and was kind of our champion and leader from the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. After this meeting, she got in touch with me and she asked me if I wanted to serve as the executive secretary of this newly formed NSTC subcommittee. And she asked me because when she came into OSTP, there was a fellow, an STPF fellow who was at OSTP at the time, who had been hired during the Trump administration and who had taken on the executive secretaryship of several subcommittees out of OSTP at that time when she was there, and of course had done a great job. Ryan Donahue was his name, and I called him up, asked him about the work. He encouraged me to go ahead and take the position. I asked my mentor, my supervisor at USAID, and since it was the White House, even though they had asked me to back off on this Indigenous peoples work, because it was the White House, they're like, yeah, go for it, go ahead. And so that has pretty much taken over my life since then. We have weekly meetings. I'm the person who sends out all the calendar invitations. I write up the agendas. I circulate the agendas for approval to the co-chairs. I take the notes and I circulate the notes for approval afterwards. I coordinate with we have about a roster of about 120 people. I coordinate with all those folks to answer their questions if they have them, to make sure the roster is up to date. I keep track of our attendance. And I've been developing a set of internal processes and procedures to kind of guide the work of the subcommittee itself. There are this is a really interesting thing about the federal government at this level. There's not really a lot of rules. You'd be surprised. There's a handbook that we have that dictates how the NSTC operates. That's the National Science and Technology Council. But it's a very kind of a nebulous organization because it's interagency. It's housed in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which does have an office, but the NSTC itself is an interagency body made up of volunteers from the different agencies. There's only one or two people that actually have their job as working at the NSTC or as guiding the NSTC, and the guy who's in charge of it right now has like 6 other jobs, so it's not at the top of his list of things to take care of. So I've been drawing up a set of internal processes and procedures to kind of guide the work and to create some formal rules around the work that we do as a subcommittee. And I've been, continually trying to circulate that to my co-chairs, the leadership of the subcommittee, to get their approval on changes and on these things, so that if there's an administrative change or if, as there's a lot of turnover at the White House, people come in for a 1-year detail usually. It's such intense work that they don't last usually more than a year or two. So we have a lot of turnover at the higher levels. And we need kind of these written sets of procedures to make sure that there's some institutional memory, because otherwise there really isn't any. People come and go really quickly and things change all the time. So that's a lot of what I've been doing with my fellowship, and then tracking, again, the work of the implementation of this guidance that we have. Let me jump ahead. A couple other things that just kind of interesting and exciting things that I've done as part of my fellowship at USAID. I was asked to travel to Senegal. There was going to be a high-level delegation from the Nepal government, including the Minister of Agriculture. They were going to go to Senegal to learn about how Senegal does a joint sector review, which is basically an evaluation of its agricultural policy program within the Senegalese government. They apparently do a really good job of this. Nepal was going to come and learn from Senegal on how they do this work. Of course, Nepal speaks English, Senegal speaks French, so we were going to have translators. And I was coming as an emissary from the policy office at USAID to write about this, to kind of document the process of this learning exchange. I got on the plane at JFK in New York City to fly overseas to Senegal, and I sat down next to a guy who runs the Senegal program at the World Bank. His name was Theo. He informed me when I sat down that the World Bank had just postponed or suspended, all non-essential travel to Senegal because the country had erupted in protests. There were people being killed, and so, you know, the World Bank had suspended travel to Senegal. He was going back because he lived there and because he was in charge of the program, so he was considered essential. I didn't know anything about it. I started scrolling through my emails from USAID and from the State Department. Not a whole lot in there. There's a couple of like pretty bland notices about protest, imminent protest, but nothing serious. No communications directly from my office or from the State Department. And I was already on the plane. So I flew to Senegal. I contacted my mentor and she's like, well, when you get there, if anything, if it's really bad, you can just turn around and fly right back home. Or, you know, I also hadn't heard from my hotel to see if they were sending a car to pick me up at the airport. Turns out that's because the government had shut down the internet service to stop the protests from spiraling out of control. And so my hotel didn't have internet and they weren't able to email me or get my email about my need for transport from the airport. So I get to the airport, my mentor was like, well, you can just get a taxi and take it to your hotel. And Theo, when we got there, he was like, that's a really bad idea. Don't take a taxi. It's an hour from the airport to Dakar. And there's no guarantee you're going to make it. So he took me in his personal car, dropped me off at the front of my hotel with his driver. Really, the World Bank delivered me into safety on this one. And it was a really interesting experience. The State Department, the embassy did reach out to me while I was there. I was staying in a non-approved hotel because I got there a couple of days early. I'd gotten a beachfront hotel. And so that's this picture that you see here, me having my nice luxurious meal on the beach of the gorgeous, I guess, Atlantic waters. And then the next day, when I went and walked around my neighborhood, I discovered that indeed, all that stuff that I'd listened to all night, those were explosions, in fact. And the people that I saw them carrying off the boats in the middle of the night, those were wounded people in the protests. I'd been standing on my balcony, watching over the beach all night and listening to the explosions from the protests, listening to the gunfire. There was gunfire on our beach. I was watching them carry the wounded off boats right there in front of me. And it turns out, yeah, that's actually what I was hearing. This is right outside the doors of my hotel. So this was my experience, 50 hours in Dakar, pretty exciting. Turned around and went right back home the next day because obviously the minister of Nepal wasn't going to come into that kind of situation. So they canceled the whole meeting. And that was my trip to Dakar. That was my one big trip on behalf of USAID. And then a couple other fun things. Christmas party at USAID. We get to hang out with the administrator, Samantha Power, former ambassador to the UN, US ambassador to the UN. Here's a little tour of the White House that we did during an office retreat. That was really fun. And then if you want to know what it's really like to work at USAID, this is it right here. Zoom meetings in an empty cubicle. Hopefully it's empty or else you'll be competing with other people to be heard on Zoom. Pretty quiet in those offices, although they are trying to bring people back into the offices there. Let's see where we at, 30 minutes. All right, so this will be a little bit shorter since I'm still in process, but this is my second year, National Science Foundation. I got invited to join the Office of Polar Programs and its Arctic division. They do Arctic work, they do Antarctic work, and then we also have logistics work that we fund at both poles. And I got hired on, my functional title here is Arctic Research Policy Fellow. This is our website. It's easier to just show a screenshot of it than to actually go to the website. But we do really interesting work, really all over the Arctic. This office was formed out of the Arctic Research Policy Act of 1984. And OPP was formed to oversee, or I guess the Arctic section of OPP was formed to oversee Arctic policy and research. We're the just kind of the lead agency on a lot of this work, even though not all the work takes place in our office. We do fund it, or we are the administrators for some of this work. So we do a lot of Arctic research and policy. We're very involved with the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee. Again, this is a committee, actually it's a subcommittee, if I'm not mistaken, out of the NSTC, National Science and Technology Council, but a much higher one. They have a permanent secretariat and permanent funding. They have an executive director. His name's Larry Hensman. He's an NSF employee, but he works out of OSTP, Office of Science and Technology Policy. We work on the national strategy for the Arctic region. Actually, the most recent one is 2022. This information's a little bit old. That was one of my jobs. Most recently was doing our reporting against the National Strategy for the Arctic region. I'll talk a little bit more about that. U.S. Arctic Research Commission, we're involved with the Arctic Policy Group. We fund the Arctic Research Consortium, as well as many other programs relating to Arctic research policy around the world, circumarctic, circumpolar. One of the first things that I did in my work for this team was to go to Greenland Science Week. So that was really exciting. Again, lots of opportunities to travel. When you're a fellow, you have that $15,000. And so me, my mentor, that's Roberto Delgado in the middle of this picture here. And then another fellow, Wilka Sola, is also in my same office, started the same time I did, although he's a first-year fellow. The three of us went to Greenland Science Week together. And this is really an event hosted by the government of Greenland to promote and to help coordinate science in Greenland as a form of economic development, sustainable economic development. Really, I think that's a big part of what is driving the government, but also they want to make sure that it's done properly. One of the really interesting things about Greenland is that it's a largely indigenous nation. They have been colonized by Denmark, so there's Danish people in the government, of course, but it's largely Greenlandic-led. And I think the official language is Inuit, and Inuit is spoken fluently and frequently all over Greenland. The majority of the leaders that I encountered from the Greenlandic government are Inuit. So that's really interesting, and so it makes it a very different context for doing Indigenous people's work and Indigenous engagement from a national Arctic research standpoint. We got to take some good side trips. Here's a picture of Will. I'm standing in front of a boat in the harbor. This isn't the boat that we took, but we took another one off to a distant community. I'm not going to show all the pictures of it. And here's just a shot of some alpenglow that we saw outside of one of the conference plenaries one day. It just is a really gorgeous place, really exciting to be able to travel on behalf of the U.S. government for this. And this is one of the things you can do as a fellow, is go to conferences. We gave 3 presentations while we were there, talked to a lot of people, networked with a lot of people, both in Greenland and U.S. State Department. We went to a party at the embassy, at the consul's house at the embassy. Met with the USAID representative there, did a lot of ate reindeer steaks and whale blubber, stuff like that. Pretty exciting. Here's just a couple of pictures of kind of the plenary session. Here's Mike Willis. He's one of our NSF-funded researchers doing hazards research and monitoring. One of the things that he did was he set up some monitoring at the Nuuk airport to measure subsidence at the airport. And this was in direct request to his engagement with the Nuuk government, or with the government of Greenland, who realized that they had a problem there at the Nuuk airport and needed some help figuring out what was going on. So that's a lot of what we do as the U.S. government, is in the context of doing this climate change research, also doing it in a way that serves, the communities where this research is being conducted. And Mike Willis is a good example of that. And then you also have here Sarah Olsvig, chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, doing a presentation on their priorities for research and engagement, coming from the perspective of one of the biggest representative bodies of Indigenous peoples around the world. And so that's who that is. Very impressive organization, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and a very impressive woman, Sarah Olsvig. Definitely someone to pay attention to. One of the things that we do as National Science Foundation and as, agencies of the federal government is to support federal strategies for different aspects of, federal programming. One of those things at USAID when I was there was working on our climate change strategy and reporting against that for USAID. That would have been an internal USAID climate strategy that I was reporting on there. Here at OPP, I just finished some reporting that we did for the national strategy for the Arctic region. And this included everything from defense strategy, homeland security, to research strategy and stuff like that. Of course, being NSF, our equities, so to speak, that's a good word, that a good Fed government word that we use a lot. Equities are in research strategy. So we're the lead agency on several of these bullet points, these strategic objectives and sub-objectives, and there's next steps. And we're the lead and or collaborating agency on several of these. So I had to pull data from our programming and our funded awards and our activities as an office, and kind of jot down or, put into a spreadsheet all the ways in which our activities had met the objectives of the federal government in terms of climate change research, and proper engagement with Indigenous communities. That's part of this strategy as well. So it's interesting if you want to see what the official policies and official priorities of the federal government are. These strategies are a good place to look. So it's one thing I just finished. And again, this is I'm not doing it's not rocket science, the work that I'm doing. It's not easy because there's so much going on. There's so many things to learn. But you get to interact with some really interesting people in the process. For this NSAR reporting, I just reached out directly to Ambassador David Bolton to get some of my questions answered about how he wanted this reporting done. And it started a whole big thread of conversation for us as an interagency trying to figure out, like, well, what does it mean, if something is ongoing versus in progress? If it's in progress, that means it's not finished. If it's ongoing, it means it's actually finished, but it's still happening. Really technical details like that people were like, wow, I'm really glad you asked this question. I thought it was kind of a dumb question myself, but apparently nobody else did because they all had the same question. So there you go. I also had a meeting last month with the head of the National Nature Assessment, was able to offer him some information that was really helpful to him in his work. And then I met a couple of weeks ago with the leadership of the White House Council on Native American Affairs, and have started getting invited to their staff group meetings and to some of their committee meetings, including on data and on their Indigenous International Indigenous Peoples Working Group out of the White House Council on Native American Affairs. So really exciting, the work that you get to do here. It's pretty high level. And then just for fun stuff, this week was the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the organization that funds the fellowship. And so I flew to Denver. Well, I was already in Colorado, so I drove to Denver and had organized a tour for several fellows of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. That was really fun. This is a picture of that. We got to, this is one of the rooms where they test appliances to see how efficient they are. We got to see the EV charging stations that they're testing. We got to see the laboratory where they're testing batteries and seeing what happens under high loads and low loads. And so all this different work that they're doing. We got to see the solar energy research laboratory where they're doing research to find better ways to do solar, finding out how resilient solar panels are, all kinds of different stuff. It was really fascinating. And the person that organized that tour for us was a former fellow. She was really happy to do it, and we were really glad to coordinate with her on that. And also, I think NREL can be, as members of the public, you can go to NREL and get a tour. You can also go to the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is in Boulder. I went there to meet with a couple of our PIs there at NCAR, but they're open to the public, and I got to do a tour there, and just really fascinating and fun stuff to get to do as an emissary of the National Science Foundation. And as a fellow, you get a ton of freedom as a fellow. And in spite of all that, the meetings keep coming. This is my calendar. This is a really light load this week. I've got a couple of trainings and I've got a lot of empty spots. But these subcommittee meetings keep coming every week. There's a different group. It's either our co-chairs or our extended leadership group or the full subcommittee, which meets monthly. And so I have to keep on top of those calendar invitations and the meeting notes and all that kind of stuff in the agendas. Here's a draft agenda. I had to black out some of the Zoom link just in case. We actually have been FOIA'd. We found out as a subcommittee, we found out in August, I think, right as I was departing USAID and my position there, that the Office of Science and Technology Policy and National Science Foundation had both received Freedom of Information applications for everything pertaining to the Indigenous Knowledge Committee or Subcommittee or the guidance that was produced. This was kind of a big surprise to a lot of us. There's since been a little bit of media attention and quite negative on the work that's being done by the federal government on Indigenous knowledge. It's being painted with a pretty negative brush. And there's also one of the people doing this work, and the guy that issued the FOIA and has received the documents and requested the FOIA has put them out to the public. So I'm waiting for my personal cell phone number to be put out to the public, because that's coming up in one of the next batches of documents that's going to be released. I have put that on my email address, my signature line, because nobody knows how to use the phones in these office buildings, and I'm never in the office anyway, so I had put my personal cell phone number. Anyway, so all that stuff is being released to the public. So that's definitely one of the dangers that you have to deal with working for the federal government. It's just having to, you know, being exposed to that kind of thing. Ostensibly, if you don't put your personal information in there, it's not a big deal. But anyway, we have been FOIA'd, and so our work has, you know, been the subject of some ongoing interesting commentary from the public. But that continues to be the bulk of the work that I do as a fellow. And then I'll just leave you with these slides, these deadlines. The application deadline is November 1st. I know that's a long ways off, but I wanted to go ahead and get this Tropilunch presentation and to give folks that might be interested some time to look into, you know, what that application looks like, start writing it up. It's pretty extensive, and sending it out for review. That's really important. I met with at least one or two former fellows when I was putting together my application, and just got so much useful information and feedback on the application. And again, you know, not expecting to be the person that they wanted to hire for this fellowship, and here I am. So it's definitely worthy to talk to people who've done it before, and I'm happy to talk to anybody at TCD who wants to apply and try and come work for the government for a couple of years and see if you like it or not. With that, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them or to elaborate in any way.